All right, so welcome to the first screencast of Chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to talk about how economists build models, which are kind of simplified versions of the real world in order to think about the more complex real world. And we're going to get our first model in this set of screencasts in Chapter 2. All right. So previously, we talked about what is economics. We talked about how economics is the study of how people allocate their scarce resources to satisfy their unlimited wants. And we said scarcity just refers to the fact that, almost everything in society, there's a limited amount of it. There's a limited amount of money, there's a limited amount of time, resources. All those things are scarce, all right? And then we made an important point to talk about incentives and how people respond to incentives, be they positive incentives or negative incentives. We also talked about unintended consequences that can happen because people may be responding to incentives that weren't exactly intended, right? So in this chapter, the big question that we're going to talk about is, well, what's the main way in which economists study the economy? And the main way economists do that is by building models, which are simplified versions of the real world. So in this class, we're mostly going to be talking about theoretical models. And so we're going to have things like the supply and demand diagram. In this chapter, we're going to have something called the production possibilities frontier. And these are just simplified versions of the real world that we think are useful ways to think about the real world. All right. In other types of economics, economists will use statistical models and real world data to try to better understand the real world. So those are some of the different kinds of models that economists might use. We're going to then, after we develop that production possibilities frontier, we're going to then use it to look at the benefits of specialization in trade. We talked about this in Chapter 1, and we're going to be a little more precise about it in this chapter. All right. And we're going to talk about, at the very end, the very last screencast, what is the trade-off between having more now and having more later. All right. So what is the scientific method that's used in economics? Well, it's similar to the one used in the hard sciences. We construct a theory or a hypothesis, then we design experiments, or we go collect data to test some of the implications of the theory, and then we might revise or refute the theory based on the evidence. In my upper level classes, I go a lot more into philosophy of science, and I would probably have some quibbles with some of the way that our textbook puts this, but for us, this is really good enough. I mean, economists go about coming up with theories and models, and they use statistical data to try to test if the implications of those models are useful to us in the real world. I would put it slightly different, but again, it's fine for us. What are some of the differences from the hard or natural sciences? Well, an economist, it's rare that we can actually run controlled experiments. It's rare we get the petri dish, 2 petri dishes, and we swab our ears and we put it on the petri dish, and we come back a week later to see what's grown on the dish. And then we know that the only difference between the two is that we swabbed this one. And so we know that the different result is perfectly due to the fact that we treated one in a different way. Most of the time, economists, we don't get that. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we're able to run lab experiments. But for the most part, we aren't able to do that. So we get data that we observe. We have to form theories about what we observe. All right. We often use historical data in order to try to better get a handle on how our different theories are playing out in the real world. All right. So the first thing that is an important distinction in economics is the difference between positive economics and normative economics, or positive analysis and normative analysis. So what's the difference? It's not like positive or negative. It's a little bit different. A positive statement is one that is a claim that can be tested, and at least hypothetically we could figure out if it was true or false. All right. So it's supposed to be a factual claim about the real world. All right. Like the sun is still out today. That's a positive statement. All right. The moon is made of cheese is a positive statement. We can find out whether that's true or not. All right. So that's the idea of a positive statement. A normative statement is a statement of opinion that can't really be tested to whether it's true or false. And it's often thought of as what ought to be or what should be the case. All right. And economics mixes both of these. But for the most part, we try as much as we can to stay in the positive statements. We try to be dispassionate analysts trying to understand the world, as opposed to people who are trying to affect policy in one way or the other. Of course, there are economists who do that other side, but most economists in most colleges and universities are about doing research and trying to figure out what's going on in the world. Which one of these is generally preferred? Well, I'm not sure which is preferred, but we like to stay in this positive world because we hope that we can eventually test our claims with real-world data, and we can see if our models and theories are useful ways of thinking about the real world. All right. So that's all for positive and normative statements. I don't have a fun clip at the end of this one, unfortunately, but I'll leave you with that, and I'll see you in the next screencast.